Welcome back to Faith and Practice, and this is part 2 of our Biblical Theology series where we will be exploring the main storyline of the Bible. So in Genesis 6 through 9, we saw a global flood that completely destroyed all of mankind. And in Genesis 10, we saw the promise stayed alive. Also in Genesis 9, the promise stayed alive in Shem. And in Genesis 10, we have what's called the Table of Nations, and that's the creation of nations following the Tower of Babel incident. So this immediately sort of throws up a question, because you have these different individual nations, and the question is, so the promise is in the line of Shem, but are these other nations abandoned? And in Genesis 12:1, we immediately get an answer to that question. Ham's children and Japheth's children are not abandoned. God reaffirms his promise and his commitment to bring salvation to all families of the earth in the election of Abraham. He says, and in you, all families of the earth will be blessed. And God reaffirms that it will be the biological descent of Abraham that will be his means of bringing about salvation. In Genesis 13, he says, I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth. So the promise is connected with having children and with Abraham's descendants. And the concept of covenant is going to be really central here. We're going to see that God enters into covenant with Abraham. This is not the first biblical covenant. You could say that God was in covenant with Adam. He demanded certain things from him. He promised certain things. And Adam was really the representative of all mankind. So he was our covenant head. It's going to be really important later on. That means that in Adam, we all fell. And we can see that because the curse that came onto Adam, which is pain in childbirth, painful labor of the hands, all those things, those are imputed to us. People still suffer in childbirth. There is still painful work. So as we go along here, we're going to see how God progressively enters into new covenants with new promises and new stipulations, most notably now here with Abraham. And the most striking thing is that these covenants are predicated on nothing. God just comes up to a random guy who's living in his father's tent somewhere in a far-off land. He says, I will bless you and I will make your name great. And Paul's going to pick up on this later, and he's going to show us how God comes and he gives the promise that he will bring salvation prior to any effort, prior to circumcision, prior to any of that. God initiates these promises and these new covenants on his own accord, of his own free will. So we've been following the line of the promise, the seed of the woman that will crush the head of the serpent, and it's always been tied to physical descent. So as we come to the story of Abraham, who's in the promised line, we have a problem. He's 80 years old and he has no children. And God comes to Abraham and he promises him a child, and that's against anything that you would normally expect just by biology. And we have a really interesting thing here, because Abraham believes God, and the narrator tells us it was counted to him as righteousness. And it's actually hard to overstate how important this is, because starting from the fall, this is the first time that somebody tells us how you can be righteous before God. And the answer is by having faith in what God is doing, by having faith in the promises of God. And that is going to be the structure of the entire Bible, all the way through to Jesus Christ, including the Mosaic covenant, that to be righteous before God means to have faith in what he's doing and the salvation that he is going to bring through the promised line. So following the promises of God, in Genesis 15, God comes and he makes his covenant with Abraham. And what happens is Abraham has to cut up these animals and split them in two and create a walkway down the middle. And the idea is that you walk through this gruesome scene of split dead animals. And the idea behind it is kind of may a similar fate befall me if I break the terms of this agreement. And instead of Abraham walking through these dead animals, this symbol of carnage, and promising absolute loyalty to God, what happens is there's a theophany, an appearance of God, and he walks through those corpses himself, promising absolute faithfulness and absolute dedication to fulfilling the terms of his promises and his covenant. So there are three really important moves and steps that I want us to remember with Abraham. One, God reaffirms his promise and his dedication to save all nations, all peoples, all families of the earth through the promised line. Two, God promises things that are beyond human ability, like the no child, an old man, to show that he's the one who's going to accomplish it, and he binds himself by covenant to fulfill what he promises. And three, it's Abraham's faith in the promise of God that makes him righteous before God. So those are the most important elements of the Abraham story. There's more that you could say about it as far as how it develops the biblical story. There's very interesting stuff going on with Melchizedek. We'll save that for another time. Next time, we'll try to get into Jacob and Isaac, or Isaac and Jacob.